Good morning. My name is Gila Franklin Siegel, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. The JCRC is the umbrella public affairs, advocacy, and community relations arm for over 100 synagogues and other institutions throughout the Greater Washington area. Through our Dr. Stewart Lessons Israel Action Center, we engage in year-round advocacy, education, and relationship building, all in furtherance of a strong, safe, and democratic Israel and an ironclad relationship between the United States and Israel. We thank the hundreds of people who registered for this webinar and are logging on. Many thanks as well to Charlotte Barrios and Alan Brody on our staff for their work in organizing this morning's program. A few housekeeping items. Ambassador Ross will be speaking for the first part of the webinar. I'll follow up with one or two questions, and then for the last portion of our hour together, we'll be taking as many questions as possible from participants. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask a question. I'll be fielding those questions as they come in, and only Ambassador Ross and I will be able to see them. There's also a closed captioning feature at the bottom of your screen should you require it. It's now been 1 week since Israel launched its bold, forceful attack on Iran. By all accounts, Israel has experienced significant military successes during these days, reflecting years of sophisticated planning and intelligence and dominating military prowess. Iran has retaliated with missile attacks that so far have cost dozens of Israeli lives and hundreds of injuries and caused significant damage to buildings and institutions. Millions of Israelis have been racing to secure rooms and public shelters numerous times each night and during the day as well, and schools and many workplaces continue to remain closed. In the face of everything that Israelis are enduring, support for Prime Minister Netanyahu's decision to attack is quite strong among Israeli and American Jews. Our support for Israel is married with recognition of the wealth of unknowns at this pivotal moment and of the larger regional context, including the ongoing war in Gaza, where dozens of Israeli hostages remain, over 20 of whom we believe are still alive, and where humanitarian aid issues continue to be a challenge. To give us insight and perspective, we're grateful to welcome Ambassador Dennis Ross, counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Ambassador Ross also teaches at Georgetown University's Center for Jewish Civilization. A scholar and diplomat with more than 2 decades of experience in Soviet and Middle East policy, Ambassador Ross worked closely with Secretaries of State James Baker, Warren Christopher, and Madeleine Albright. For more than 12 years, he played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East process, dealing directly with the parties as the U.S. point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. We're so grateful, Ambassador Ross, to you for joining us here today, and I will now pass the baton to you.
Okay. Well, look, very good to be with all of you. I am just back from Israel, left Israel via Jordan and flew back from there. I was in Israel for the first several days, really for the first 5 days, 4 days of the war. So what I want to do is I want to give you a sense of A, the realities within Israel, B, why did the Israelis make this decision to do it now? C, how is this likely to end? And D, can something not only related to Iran, but something for the region, can something for the region in a kind of a best case way come out of this? And I'll kind of wrap this up with a little bit of hope, but it'll be tinged with a recognition that one's best hopes for the Middle East are rarely met. It doesn't mean you shouldn't plan for how you might get there, but you also have to plan for what happens if you don't. So let me start with Israel. First, I would say the mood in Israel is quite remarkable. One of the things I've often said when I go around campuses is that the Iranians, Nasrallah, Sinwar, one of the things they never understood about Israel is that there is a profound, deep civic culture. Even when a majority of Israelis may not trust the government, this particular government has not had a high level of trust with a majority of Israelis. The fact is there is a commitment of Israelis to each other. The depth of this civic culture, the depth of this sense of commitment to each other is what separates Israel from most of the other countries in the region, certainly separates it from the Iranians, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the like. So we've seen this collective sense, uh, and that's emerged in the context of what we've seen since the war began. I would note that I often joke that 80% of Israelis can't agree on whether it's day or night, but I can tell you that 80% of Israelis agree that this was a necessary war. The entire political,
Ambassador Ross,
yeah.
We are getting lots of messages that folks can't hear you. I'm wondering if you need to be closer to the microphone or.
All right. All right. Let me try this. Is this better? Do you hear better?
I feel that's better. I hope that other people feel it's better.
Okay. Well, you'll see if you still get it. All right.
Okay. So I apologize for interrupting.
All right. So anyway, the thrust of what I'm saying so far is there is a kind of consensus in Israel that this is a necessary war, that Israel didn't have a choice, that Iran has been this ongoing threat for some time. The political opposition to a person supports the decision of Prime Minister Netanyahu to do this. You have someone like Avigdor Lieberman, who has been one of his fiercest critics, in his words, tipping his hat to the decision that was made. So point one is, coming out of Israel, as I did, what I had a sense was a very resilient population, a population quite resolved to see this through, and understanding that this is a war of necessity, not a war of choice, and a unified public ready to do what is necessary. So that's sort of point one. Point two is, why now? Why was this decision made by the Prime Minister now? And I think the answer to that is there was a perception that there was a window of opportunity. You have the reality that Hezbollah has been dramatically weakened. Hezbollah had 150,000 rockets. Some people refer to Hezbollah as being an insurance policy for Iran. It was never an insurance policy. It was a deterrent. It was the threat of 150,000 rockets from Hezbollah that always deterred the Israelis from making the decision to go after the Iranian nuclear infrastructure and ballistic missile infrastructure in an overt way. So, there's not the kind of deterrent that would have limited the Israelis. There was not the threat of 150,000 rockets that could have saturated the Israeli missile defense network. Beyond that, last October 26, the Israelis took out the vast majority of the Iranian strategic air and missile defense capabilities. And that created a vulnerability within Iran, and it created an openness, but it was also a window because over time, the Iranians would be able to renew this. And in fact, one of the factors that drives the sense of timing, Israel at the same time on October 26 not only destroyed the radars of all the main strategic air and missile defenses, but they took out at the time 90% of Iran's ballistic missile production capability. They didn't destroy all of it, but they dramatically reduced it. But they also saw that the Iranians were recouping in that area, not in the area of defenses, air and missile defenses, but in the area of ballistic missile production capability. So, window of opportunity in part because of Hezbollah not being able to threaten with 150,000 rockets, window of opportunity in part because of the vulnerability, the lack of air defense, but also an increasing sense that Iran could reconstitute its ballistic missile capabilities. And you have to understand, when I say ballistic missile production capabilities, Iran had 2,000. Coming into this war, they had 2,000 long-range ballistic missiles that could hit Israel. So that was already a continuing threat. But against this backdrop, you had a few other things. You had the Iranians beginning in February. The Iranians beginning in February began to enrich at almost 4 times the levels they had enriched before. Prior to February, the most they had enriched to 60%. I understand enriching to 60% is very close to weapons grade. They had been enriching 9 kilograms a month. Starting in February, they went from 9 kilograms to almost 40 kilograms a month. That's more than 1 bomb's worth a month. It meant by by June, they had 10 bombs worth at 60%. They probably had another 5 or 6 at 20%. The more you accumulate that kind of highly enriched uranium, the more it could be dispersed to places that no one, including the Israelis, might have known about, preserving what could be basically a longer term capability to produce a nuclear weapon. The combination that they were recouping in the ballistic missile production capability, the reality that they were enriching at an unprecedented rate to 60%. No country that ever enriched to 60% did not then go ahead and get a nuclear weapon, meaning every country that's enriched to 60% has then produced nuclear weapons. You had President Trump saying, okay, I want diplomacy, I want to give diplomacy a chance, but he created a 60-day clock. Note that the Israelis struck on day 61. The day before, on day 60, the Board of Governors of the IAEA, which is the UN's nuclear watchdog agency, came out with a resolution. They hadn't had one like this for 20 years, in which they said, we cannot affirm that Iran has a peaceful program, and we see them in violation of their nuclear nonproliferation obligations. So all this together created a moment. Now, obviously, this kind of an attack was prepared over years. This didn't just come at the last minute. The timing was dictated by the sense that the window could close. The timing was also indicated or dictated by, I think, Prime Minister Netanyahu feeling he had not a green light, but at least a yellow light, that if, as long as Israel didn't strike within the 60 days, it would at least have a yellow light, and that President Trump wouldn't oppose it, and looking at the developments on the Iranian side. So that helps to explain, I think, the timing of this. Okay, what are the end goals? What's the objective? The objective, I'll put it in a way that isn't typically heard. Everybody says, okay, the objective is to destroy or at least set back dramatically Iran's capacity to develop a nuclear weapon, set back dramatically its ability to develop ballistic missiles. Those are both true, but they fall under something that I think is broader. I think what you really see the objective being is Israel changing the map in the following way. Iran has felt through the proxy network and through its own buildup of threats the whole idea that Qasem Soleimani talked about creating a ring of fire around Israel, meaning it would be under constant pressure, and that there was no real answer other than for Israel to go after the proxies. The whole purpose of this is basically to put Iran in a position where that is gone, that they can't threaten the Israelis anymore. That's the aim of this, to weaken Iran to the point where it can't threaten the Israelis anymore. Now, can that mean there's regime change? If the regime were to fall, I think from the Israeli standpoint, that would be seen as a kind of potential benefit, but I don't think it's an objective per se. I don't think they're saying we're doing this because we can't end this until we have regime change, because that could be open-ended, and Israel can't afford this kind of a war to be open-ended. So I think the objectives are more what I described. I think what will govern the sense of timing is that Israel has a hierarchical list of targets, those that they would consider you have to be able to destroy, or you really haven't set back the nuclear infrastructure and program enough. And that would obviously include Fordo. This won't end without something having been done to Fordo, either militarily or diplomatically. And we can get into that in the Q&A. That, I think, is in this hierarchical list of targets that have to be destroyed. There's a second category of targets that are important, but not necessarily critical in terms of a necessity. That first group creates you, without destroying those targets, you haven't succeeded in what you set out to do. The second set of targets will be those that give you a higher level of confidence. You are pushing back the threat much farther, and you're weakening Iran to the point where they will be chastened, which is what I'm describing as a larger objective. They will be chastened. There's a next set of targets that would be under the category of desirable. I think that's less critical. And if you ask me what's the time frame here, The prime minister yesterday said he's not going to get into timeframes. He's not going to let the Iranians know what Israel is doing and how it's planning and so forth. But I think there is, another 10 days to 2 weeks to satisfy that all these targets have been addressed. Now it comes back to Fordo. There's a perception that Israel can't do Fordo. I don't believe Israel would have launched this attack if it was based on the premise that the U.S. has to come in. I just don't believe that. You could not have known, especially given President Trump's position, the MAGA position, you could not have known that he would be prepared to come in. And it's almost certain, even if he was saying, okay, if after 60 days I haven't achieved diplomacy, you can go ahead. He never said to the prime minister, I will then join you. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. The important thing here is it is inconceivable to me that Israel would have launched this without a plan for Fordo independently of the U.S. Yes, it would be easier because the U.S. has the massive ordnance penetrator, a bomb, a 30,000-pound bomb that was developed explicitly, exclusively, specifically for dealing with Fordo. I keep hearing the term bunker busters. That's always been wrong about Fordo. Fordo is a mountain. The site is built into a mountain. No bunker buster can destroy it. You need a mountain buster. The massive ordnance penetrator, which I've pushed since 2015 for us to provide the Israelis into at least B-2s, one of the planes that can carry it, I've pushed for that for one simple reason. This is the one system that can actually destroy Fordo. Now, Israel doesn't have it, doesn't have a plane that could carry it, hasn't trained on B-2s, which would have to understand how you operate this. So it's too late for that to be the case right now. But it still is inconceivable to me that Israel wouldn't have developed a set of options. Think about everything Israel's done. They have consistently surprised the world, not to mention the Iranians and us, about what they've been able to do. So I am convinced they probably have a set of options that they have developed for Fordo. It won't look like or be a reflection of what the U.S. would do, but it will be very much something that the Israelis will have worked out. We've already seen them do things that no one thought was possible. My sense is we will continue to see them do things that will surprise everybody. All right, how does this end? It ends either with the Israelis in a position where they can say, we have achieved all the objectives that we set out to achieve. Now, the Iranians will declare that they haven't been defeated. Whatever the Israelis say, whatever they actually achieve, the Iranians will say they haven't been defeated. But there's a very clear vulnerability there. When I was still in Jordan, I heard there and I heard elsewhere how the Iranians were reaching out to all the Arabs saying they were ready to negotiate. My guess is they will resist in the negotiations giving up enrichment. The ground rule for the United States, for the president, should be this doesn't end unless, at least diplomatically, if you want a diplomatic outcome, you have to understand you will be giving up enrichment. You had a chance, as he has been saying publicly, you had a chance to do a deal, you didn't do it, now you paid the price. And understand the price. Their military has been decapitated. The Revolutionary Guard, who are basically the protectors of the regime, they have been decapitated. When I say decapitated, I don't just mean the chief of staff, the deputy chief of staff, the head of intelligence. I mean the top 15 to 20 officers who've been together since the Iran-Iraq war. Think about that. These group of 30 ranking officers who have run the military and the Revolutionary Guard, they began together in the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. They're a group that basically understood each other, trusted each other, operated, developed doctrines. Everything was done as a collective. They're gone. It's not just disruption, it means starting over. So there's a huge vulnerability there, a huge disruption there. Israel killed the top 10 nuclear scientists. They have destroyed the central bank of Iran. They destroyed refineries that feed gasoline to the public. There is rationing right now in Iran. You had a public that was already unhappy before this. So the regime is bound to feel they have to protect the regime itself as they go forward. That's They will not admit weakness, but there's a reality that they are weak. Again, how does this end? I have a new book out called Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World. I have a 50-page chapter on Iran in that book. I looked at every administration's policy from Jimmy Carter to today in that book. Several things come through on the Iranian side. Number one, the most important preoccupation is survival. Number two, from the late 1980s, when we were reflagging ships in the Gulf to protect them from Iranian attacks, so Iranians were attacking these ships because they were providing effectively the oil trade for Iraq. They were trying to cut off all of Iraq's revenues. We reflagged the ships. We ended up destroying most of the Iranian Navy. We destroyed their oil platforms. We inadvertently shot down a civilian airliner, and Khomeini had declared they would fight the war however long it took. They did a ceasefire because they were fearful of getting in a sustained war with us, which they saw would threaten the regime. Again, regime survival is number one. Since the late 1980s, for the Iranians, of not getting into a direct war with the United States has been a fundamental preoccupation. Whenever they have felt threatened or they see a high risk of action, and that doesn't mean militarily, anything they think that would be costly as they measure cost, they were prepared to make concessions. Tactical concessions to be sure, but concessions nonetheless. There is an approach here where you could produce a diplomatic outcome. President Trump is certainly creating an aura of threat. I don't know whether he's going to strike Fordo or not. Again, he talks about, he'll make a decision within 2 weeks. Today, the French, German, and British foreign ministers are meeting with the Iranian foreign minister. I suspect this is designed to create a diplomatic pathway. I can tell you, as I said, the outreach from the Iranians to the Arabs, who they then were hoping would come to the Trump administration, were all about their readiness to negotiate. So this notion that they wouldn't negotiate is, I think, an illusion. And the point is not whether they were prepared to negotiate, but what are the ground rules from a U.S. standpoint for an acceptable outcome? And that acceptable outcome has to start with no enrichment, because it means the Iranians are giving up forever the nuclear weapons option. The problem with the JCPOA is not that it didn't limit the Iranian program, it did. Not that it didn't buy time, it bought 15 years. The problem with it, it allowed the Iranians legitimately to build a very large nuclear infrastructure with no limits. That meant they were deferring a nuclear weapons option, they weren't giving it up. They need to give it up. That has to be an outcome here. And there also has to be an outcome that includes limitations on their ballistic missile capability. Their ability to reconstitute their proxy network, I think even that right now is probably in doubt within Iran. They invested huge amounts of money, at least $40 billion in Syria. It's all gone. It's all gone. I suspect the need for protecting the regime on the inside requires a lot of reconstruction within Iran itself. And here's where the Trump administration can offer, if you meet these conditions, we will be prepared gradually to lift sanctions as we measure whether or not you're meeting a condition, with an understanding that if you violate any of this, maybe you unleash us. I think the verbal threats of President Trump might be sufficient to produce an outcome. I think in the end, it's best if the Israelis are able to succeed on their own without us. And we can get into why that might be the case. But surely, if in the end they can't do Fordo, if it turns out I'm wrong and they need the U.S., this can't end without Fordo being addressed, as I said, either militarily or diplomatically. Okay, assuming we have an outcome that looks close to what I'm describing, and that certainly is within the realm of possibility, I would say it's plausible. You could see some other big changes. If Prime Minister Netanyahu comes out of this and he's able to credibly claim success, notwithstanding, Iran will point to the damage they inflicted within Israel. They will do that, because this will be the way they describe, we weren't defeated. Everybody in the region will know they were defeated. This will be their explanation. But if the prime minister comes out of this successfully, I would not be surprised if he then makes a quick move to get the rest of the hostages out of Gaza by being prepared to do a deal to end the war. The reason that it becomes more credible, I would say, is basically driven by two thoughts. Thought number one, it'll be very clear to everybody in the region, not to mention Hamas, if they violate the understandings related to Israel withdrawing, Israel will resume. It'll be very clear. Israel is rewriting the rules of the region. Iran doesn't threaten anymore. Nobody else is going to be tolerated and threatened and allowed to get away with a threat. So on that basis, he can get out because everybody knows what will happen if Hamas tries to remain in control. Hamas has already been defeated as a military. It is a terrorist group. If Israel stays in Gaza, it will face an insurgency. Hamas is the only military in the world, it's not really a military anymore, that never wears a uniform, except when there's a ceasefire and they're releasing hostages. They will simply melt back into the population and you'll face an insurgency. Israel doesn't need that. And the prime minister is in a stronger position if he comes out successfully from the Iran operation and war. He's in a stronger position to do that, both in the region in terms of perception, but he's also in a stronger position politically to face down Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. So there is a possibility that Israel is remaking the map of the Middle East and can also end the war in Gaza. Don't hold your breath and assume there'll be quick normalization with Saudi Arabia after this. All those who say, once this is all done, that will happen, that's an illusion. There's two different realities that exist in the Middle East today. The Arab states have all condemned the Israelis for carrying out this, but it's almost a pro forma. They all want the war to end because they're afraid it will ensnare them. They're not crying crocodile tears over what's happened to the Iranians. But the reason they condemn it because their publics are completely soured towards Israel because of the imagery and reality of what's happened in Gaza. The nightly appearance throughout, it's not just Al Jazeera, all the Arab networks, they show what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza, and it has soured the view of Arab publics towards Israel. That doesn't make normalization impossible, but it means it won't be something that happens soon. Even if you have the end of the war, you're not going to see a light switch that is flipped and suddenly, okay, now that's behind us, Iran has been weakened, and we can go ahead and do this. No, there's still a psychology there that will have to be dealt with, and it will take some time. But the reality, and I'll close with this, Iran did not create the conflicts in the region, but it exploited every single one of them. And when you weaken Iran and its whole proxy network to the point that they are much less capable of being a threat again, you have changed the Middle East for real, and that will make normalization over time possible. But you have to have the time because there is a psychological reality. There is, within Israel, Israelis don't see what's happening in Gaza. They see the hostages, they see soldiers that they're losing. They don't see the suffering in Gaza. There's a little bit of an emergence of that in part of the Israeli public, but for the most part, the Israeli media doesn't show it. It just doesn't show it. Israel is still a country that is consumed by a sense of trauma. When you feel trauma, you feel your own pain, almost impossible to feel anyone else's. Palestinians are also suffering from trauma. They certainly don't relate to the Israeli pain. And the Arabs see the pain of the Palestinians, and that affects them. But if you've changed the map of the Middle East in a way that is potentially possible, and it's a function of what the Israelis have done, then the ability to reshape the region for the future over time will look significantly different, much more hopeful. And what produced the Abraham Accords to begin with was a recognition on the part of especially the UAE. It's not just that we have a security interest with Israel, it's that we want to remake our societies. We want to be digitally based societies. We want to be advanced societies. We want to lead the world in renewable energies. We have all sorts of problems that we have to contend with. You look at Israel. Israel has solved its water problem. When it comes to water security, food security, cybersecurity, health security, Israel is a natural partner. And that's recognized by the Emirates. That's what produced the Abraham Accords. And the Saudis understand it. So we are potentially on the threshold of a very different Middle East than we've seen before. This war does have to be concluded in a way that leaves little doubt that Iran has not only been set back, but basically Iran is going to be internally preoccupied for some time to come. And you can build what is over time a coalition that will keep Iran isolated and give them incentive to focus on the inside and not the outside. All right, I'll stop there.
Ambassador Ross, thank you so much. There was so much packed in there, and you already answered a bunch of the questions that were posted in Q&A. Please keep them coming. I want to start off with the issue of munitions and reports that there will be, as long as this continues, this war with Iran, that there could possibly be a shortage on Israel's side of interceptor missiles, and that could possibly be true even with the U.S. Continue replenishing. So, could you speak to that in terms of how long Israel can sustain this militarily?
So look, the critical issue here are the Arrow missiles. There's an Arrow 2 and Arrow 3. And these intercept Iranian missiles outside the atmosphere. There are other interceptors, David Sling, which is more high altitude, but within the atmosphere, and also the Iron Dome. So the issue, I think, on potential shortages relate to the Arrow missile. And in here, what's mostly needed would probably be more monies for production lines within Israel. The Arrow missile is produced there. So, is there a point where Israel could run out? My guess is any war where there's really high usage of munitions always is going to create such a problem. But the Israelis have built up a stockpile for this war very much in mind. They planned this for a long time, and that included building up the stockpiles to deal with the threat. The number, even though there's destruction, the Israelis are intercepting about 90% of what the Iranians are firing. The numbers each day have gone down. There were expectations that the barrages were going to be much higher in number, and they've been lower than anticipated, and each day they've generally gone down. So there's an issue here of who runs out first. The Iranians also, you can't launch these missiles without a launcher. The Israelis right now think they've destroyed half the launchers. Now, of the 2,000 missiles, many of those, most of those were in storage. Israel has been hitting the storage depots. Is the reason that the number that the Iranians are firing every day, is it going down because the Israelis have basically destroyed enough that the Iranians can't fire more? Or is it that the Iranians are trying to take a longer view and are holding some in reserve? I don't know the answer to that. I think it's the former, but I'm not certain. I think in terms of the Arrow missiles, there will obviously be a limit on the inventory, but I think the Israelis would have programmed in this operation for at least to run several weeks. I suspect that they're okay at this point with Arrow missiles. They might need help from us, but again, the help from us is more likely to provide money so they can keep production lines operating.
I want to talk a little bit about the Trump administration in greater depth. The CNN and the New York Times reported that there was questioning about whether Iran was really as close to developing a weapon as a nuclear weapon as had been alleged. Tulsi Gabbard had testified in Congress that she thought that they were far away from it. And we know that there is a newly surging isolationist wing within the administration. How do all these factors implicate the decision for the United States to enter or not enter, and how does it impact the diplomacy in which supposedly will be engaged over the next couple of weeks?
There's several different questions embedded there, so let me deal with them, deal with each of them. Number one, President Trump has said when it comes to defining American first, he's the one who defines it, not those who, who don't want us to be involved in the Middle East, don't want us to be involved in wars. In effect, what he has said is, if you are comfortable with having Iran with nuclear weapons, then you're subjecting the United States to a real threat. They can't have nuclear weapons, and if, he said, I would like to achieve this diplomatically, but if it has to be done militarily, it'll be done militarily. Whether that means us or the Israelis, it's still not clear. He is implying, of course, when he says within the next 2 weeks he'll decide, he's also said, nobody knows what I'm going to do. So that implies he hasn't made up his mind yet, but when he makes up his mind, he'll be the only one who defines that. It won't be anybody else in the administration who defines it. And we will see. Now, there is an isolationist wing of the Republican Party. I actually say it's less an isolationist and it's more unilateralist. There is an American tradition, which I also go over in the book. There's an American tradition of unilateralism. Unilateralists don't like treaties. They don't like being obligated to anybody else. They want everything to be a transaction. There's no such thing as values. We define on our own narrow basis what we'll do and where we'll do it, and we're not bound to anybody else. That's the mindset, and there is a tradition. That's not new. That wasn't created by Donald Trump. It's not even the American firsters from the 1930s. It goes back to George Washington's farewell address, where he talks about no entangling alliances. It was a different world then. Throughout the 19th century, we used military force around the globe consistently, at a time supposedly we were isolationists, but it was in the service of our economic interests, and it was never part of an alliance system. So that tradition is there in part of the Republican Party, and it's clearly what explains the progressives on the left. The political spectrum is not a straight line left to right. It goes like in a circle. The left and the right basically have very similar attitudes about not wanting the U.S. engaged overseas. You listen to Steve Bannon, who basically said, Israel got into this war, they started on their own, they have to end it on their own. That's the mindset of an important part of President Trump's constituency. So in the end, is he going to respond to that, or is he trying to redefine that? It seems to me that he's trying to create some space for himself, saying, I'm the one who defined this movement. If you're not supporting me now, then that means you're really not part of the movement. So we'll have to see. The reality is there is a value in Israel being able to do this on its own, partly to show they didn't start something they couldn't finish, partly to be consistent with the Israeli ethos that we defend ourselves by ourselves. That would be the best outcome. But if that outcome can't be achieved because the Israelis don't have the options to do Fordo, which, as I said earlier, would surprise me. It would surprise me if Israel, after developing all the war plans for this over a number of years, it would surprise me if they hadn't prepared for Fordo as well. And I want to get back to, before I take the next question, I want to get back to another part of your question. That was the issue of Tulsi Gabbard saying, they're a long ways away from their weapon. I mentioned that they probably have about 16 bombs worth of highly enriched uranium. If they go ahead, given that accumulation, and disperse it, and you don't know where it is, then they have the basis of creating a nuclear weapon at a time of their choosing. This notion they don't have it now is irrelevant. The issue is, are you putting them in a position where they will never have that option, or are they in a position where they are retaining the option at a time of their choosing? Those who think only in terms of, gee, it's either they have it or they don't, they miss the reality of what the nature of the threat is. And the nature of the threat is, and this is one of the things I think that motivated the Israelis, was we cannot be in a position where they are retaining this option because they've been able to disperse this accumulation of highly enriched uranium. I said there was a window of opportunity and the Israelis worried that it would close. if it closed and this had been dispersed, then basically the Iranians were putting themselves in a position that at some point down the road, they could develop a nuclear weapon and we might not know it. The issue about it, why is enrichment so important? Because in enrichment you can track. The problem is once you reach a certain point and they have to weaponize, a lot of that can be done. They don't have to do a test. They can simply say, we've done it now. And they can declare to the world, we have it. And that changes the reality in the Middle East and beyond.
Trying to get to as many questions as possible. They're so thoughtful. I want to talk about the Iranian street a bit. There has been support within the Iranian population for Israel in terms of their desire to be freed of an incredibly oppressive regime. How do you evaluate the mood, and is there a danger that that will change as Iran suffers more damage in terms of collateral civilian deaths and injuries and destruction?
I think one of the things we have to know is there's no such thing as a neat, clean war. The Israelis, unlike the Iranians, the Israelis are not targeting hospitals. But where many of the military facilities are, where many of the leadership, military leadership is, many of the targets are in populated areas. It may not be the equivalent of Hezbollah and Hamas, who basically built everything underground and held their publics as hostages. But the location of a lot of these targets are in highly populated urban areas. And Iranians who get killed by those bombs, who may not be part of the regime, may even be opposed to it, they're not going to suddenly say, gee, the only reason this happened was because of the regime. We know from our own experience that those who get bombed, you look at Vietnam, we bombed certain villages because the Viet Cong took sanctuary there. The theory was, well, they'll blame the Viet Cong for taking sanctuary. No, they didn't blame the Viet Cong, they blamed us. And there is some risk that you're seeing some change in public mood, also because there are profound shortages right now on everything. The food, electricity, a lot of things are being rationed. And some of this will obviously add to the alienation of the public that says this is the regime that brought this on, has been subjecting us to this. But there'll be some reaction. And it won't all be positive towards the Israelis. We just, you make choices. There's nothing in wartime where every choice is black and white and it's obvious. And you have moral dilemmas. And you make these hard choices, you make these hard decisions, and you recognize that there's always going to be shades of gray. So for those who say, gee, we'll do this and this will unleash the Iranian population, don't assume that. You can't know that. But at the end of this regime will be dramatically weaker. And there will be a sorting out afterwards. And there will be all sorts of questions. How could the Israelis have penetrated the military intelligence establishment the way they did? There will be fundamental questions about the inability of the Iranian military to defend Iran. Israel has free reign in the center of the country and in the western part of the country. They're not necessarily having free reign in the south and the east, but they're beginning to operate more there. So, this is the inability of a country to defend itself. That will also be part and parcel of what emerges from all of this.
Want to talk a little bit about Syria and Lebanon, the two countries that did not openly condemn Israel and condemn Israel's attack on Iran. Can you speak to that in terms of why that is and what Israel can expect and what Israel is thinking in terms of the new Syrian government?
Let me start with Lebanon. The Lebanese government and army warned Hezbollah not to respond to what Israel is doing in Iran. This is a sign, as much as anything, of how weakened Hezbollah is. They were supposed to be the deterrent of Israel. That's what they were supposed to be. And what Israel has done in Lebanon by dramatically weakening Hezbollah, they gave the Lebanese a chance to reassert their sovereignty. And at this point, the fact that, there's a general, the Israelis believe they destroyed 80% of the long-range launchers and 80% of the short-range missiles. So there doesn't mean they still don't have a capability. They do, but they're dramatically weaker than they were, and their whole capability, almost the entirety of their capability below the Litani, has been destroyed. So they are not challenging what the government at this point and the army is saying, don't do anything in response to what Israel's doing vis-a-vis Iran. The future of Lebanon will still have to be worked out. Syria, I think the Israeli approach there is, they were surprised by President Trump meeting with Ahmed al-Shara. They were surprised that he lifted the sanctions. There was no forewarning of that. They look at someone who has been a part of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and they say this is someone who's been an Islamist. But what they're hearing from the UAE and others is that while they had real suspicion initially about al-Shara, they increasingly think that he's for real in terms of being quite pragmatic, and what he wants to do is focus on building up Syria. He has communicated in a variety of ways that he doesn't want any conflict with Israel. Does this mean they're going to, both in Syria and Lebanon, they're going to make peace with Israel soon? No. They're trying to put their own houses in order. It's dramatically difficult for both of them. Hezbollah turned Lebanon into a failed state. You don't turn that around very quickly. And Syria is a failed state because of the Assad regime. And Shara doesn't control all the country, doesn't control all the forces. So this is a process in each country. We have an interest in seeing both succeed. These were basically, Hezbollah was the crown jewel of the axis of resistance, what the Iranians call the axis of resistance. I call it the axis of misery because that's what they delivered every place. Syria was the geopolitical land bridge to support Hezbollah in Lebanon. Having Iran out of both is a huge development. And it also is part of the dramatic weakening of Iran. You have to test it. It'll be step by step. It's not, don't assume the Israelis are going to rush to embrace al-Shara. But I think they'll go along with the idea of testing step by step what's possible.
I want to get back to the hostages
Yeah.
for a moment. You seem to be saying that the war with Iran would need to be concluded, and then Israel will turn back to trying to negotiate an exit from the war in Gaza. Where does that potentially leave the hostages? Are there any parallel talks that are happening? How is Hamas responding to what is happening in Iran?
Look, I think Hamas is seeing how weak Iran is right now. Supposedly there are some discussions still going on. I don't have high expectations on them right now. I don't think there's a high level focus on it. I'm sad to say that because I think this is, for Israel, there's a social compact, which is we, the Israeli government, will do whatever it takes to get you back. That's part of the social compact with everybody who serves in the military or Israelis anywhere. There's obviously a majority of Israelis feel Prime Minister Netanyahu did not make that the most important objective. He made the most important objective ending Hamas's control of Gaza, but he never developed a day after strategy, again, because of the politics of the coalition. So the 3/4 of the Israeli public put getting the hostages back the most important thing. What I was saying earlier, if Prime Minister Netanyahu is able to come out of this with a perceived, and I will say an unmistakable success, which I think is clearly possible given the level of what has been done to the Iranians and the weakening of their infrastructure and the regime itself. I think he's in a very strong position to say, okay, everybody knows what we're prepared to do. There can be no doubts about that. We will be prepared to end the war, provided all the hostages are released. We will be prepared to withdraw from Gaza. But if we see Hamas trying to rebuild itself, we'll go after them. This is exactly what's happening in Lebanon, by the way. In Lebanon, the only one who is acting to take military steps is Israel. Every time they see Hezbollah make the slightest move, they even hit in southern Beirut when they saw Hezbollah trying to reconstitute a drone factory there. So yesterday, by the way, they killed, or day before yesterday, they killed the leader of a missile group. So Israel is acting in Lebanon. The same thing could be the case in Gaza if they see Hamas trying to reconstitute itself. A good strategy for Gaza is to take those Arab states. Egypt developed a plan for what would come next. It focused on the reconstruction, but not the security dimension. I can tell you from what I heard when I was in the region, there is an effort to introduce the security dimension into the plan so that you don't have an outcome where you have a technocratic government, a transitional government, but Hamas remains in control behind the scenes, the way Hezbollah used to be in Lebanon. You can't create the equivalent of Lebanon unless you actually have some kind of transitional administration, which might start by being with the Arabs, could include some from the Palestinian Authority, but would require real reform in the Palestinian Authority. Maybe that transitional administration lasts for 2 years. It's responsible for law and order. It's responsible with the Egyptians for cutting off any smuggling. You choke off the oxygen for Hamas by cutting off the smuggling from Egypt into Gaza and cut off all the monies to them. This means that Qatar can't provide monies to them. Hamas has been weakened to the point where it'll be difficult for it to resist if you have a transitional administration. The UAE was prepared before to be part of a stabilization force and to commit actual forces. I think this is something that should be revisited now. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu could come out, could agree to something that was discussed previously with the Emirates and others about what such a transitional administration could look like, agree that Israel would withdraw step by step, because Israel can't just withdraw unless you bring in gradually those forces that would replace it. You work out understandings on stopping all the smuggling. Egypt has a lot to gain by stopping the smuggling. The truth is, the tunnels the Egyptians had destroyed on their side. They had done that. But through Rafah, a lot of stuff flowed through Rafah. Mostly because there was antiquated tech scanners there, but also because there was a lot of corruption. But if Egypt has a lot to gain by being responsible for reconstruction in Gaza, you make it clear that all has to stop. And reconstruction has to be based on a premise. I was telling the Jordanians, there's no reconstruction without demilitarization. No one is going to invest in Gaza if there isn't demilitarization, because it means at some point Hamas will do this all over again. So the logic of this is a compelling logic, and I think the Arabs understand it. Part of it has been Bibi's reluctance to do the day after approach. Now I think he's in a very different position to do that and to end the war in Gaza. When this war ends, it comes after this war ends, and then I think it'll be in his interest to have a success with Iran and then show he got the hostages back. The hostages are still, from the Israeli public standpoint, the most important thing.
We're coming up on time, just have time for a couple more questions. I think it's a reflection of the fraught nature of this moment that so many of the questions that are being posted revolve around how can you trust any of these parties? And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about two things. The first is, and Tom Friedman cited you this week in referencing coercive diplomacy,
Right.
and how that works, and whether that is something that will be fruitful, and also how internally um, um, uh, the prime minister's internal pressures um, are influencing um, uh, how he will handle an exit strategy and a day after strategy for Iran versus Gaza. Um,
I think Iran and Gaza are totally different for him. He has complete support when it comes to Iran. He is not perceived as acting politically when it comes to Iran. He is perceived as acting politically when it came to Gaza. So that's why there's a sequence here. You finish Iran because there's a very basic consensus on this. And the consensus is such that it understands we're going to suffer damage, which they have. The Weizmann Institute has suffered a lot of damage. It'll take years to rebuild the Weizmann Institute. That means a lot of scientific research that was going on there, that a lot of that has been set back. And then that's just a microcosm of damage that has been suffered. The Soroka Hospital was hit, biggest hospital in the South was hit yesterday. The public is ready to absorb that damage because there's a conviction and a consensus on this. I don't see him playing politics with this, and I don't think the Israeli public sees him playing politics with this. It still means he has to have an exit strategy. Now, some of that you asked about coercive diplomacy. The Israel has been the main form of coercion because what they've been doing to weaken the Iranian regime. President Trump's threats against Iran are also part of a coercive threat. The key, diplomacy rarely works without a coercive threat, especially in these kinds of situations. The right approach, I think, for President Trump is to be communicating with the Iranians, whether it's through, mostly through others. When the Europeans meet tomorrow with the foreign minister of Iran, Arachi, the message ought to be, it's in your interest to end this war because the odds are very high. If you don't end the war, you're going to bring the Americans in. And if you bring the Americans in, they can do dramatically more even than what the Israelis are doing. That's the last thing you want to see. You want a way out? We can help you with a way out. But you have to understand the war doesn't end if you think you're going to continue to be able to enrich. That's coercion. Now, you offer coercion is both negative and positive. I just described the negative. The positive would be, we can give you a way out, but here's what's required. And when we give you a way out, which allows you to say, okay, the war is over, we can even point to relaxing the sanctions, not all at once. But given your needs right now, you can't produce electricity for your population, even though you produce oil and natural gas. You can't do that. You have water shortages that will threaten the ability to maintain your population. We can help you on that. But we're not helping you on anything if you don't accept the following. Now, you want that to work, you don't have to be broadcasting it publicly. When you put someone in the corner and they feel they have nothing to lose, then they can become even, they can say, okay, there are no limits anymore from us. They haven't been going after our forces. They haven't been going after their neighbors. Israel didn't hit Karg Island, which is the main terminal for the export of all Iranian oil. If they wanted to cut off all the revenues for the state, that would be it. They haven't done it because Iran has said always, if we can't export, nobody else can. Donald Trump doesn't want $300 barrel oil. But the Iranians want to survive. The regime wants to survive. And he can say, the risk to you is going to go up, not down, if this war doesn't end. And if you expand it, if you try to close the Strait of Hormuz, or you attack our forces, you attack the Saudis or the Emiratis and their oil facilities, then we're in. And we're going to do much more to you. And that will threaten for sure the regime. So that's coercion. That's coercive diplomacy.
On my way into the office today, I heard several experts all saying that there were low chances of this diplomatic effort succeeding. Do you care to speculate on what the world will look like a week from now, or?
Yogi Berra said the problem with predictions is they're all about the future. Look, I think there is I think there's a chance that there's a diplomatic outcome here, a chance. I still probably put it less than 50-50, but I think there's a chance for it. A lot depends upon how effectively we communicate the threats to the Iranians. The threat that President Trump is setting up, they need to believe it. You know, there's many times he said, Putin had 2 weeks. Well, it turned out he's had more than that. I still think that we may see Putin try to come in and help broker something. The Iranians can accept that because that will be their explanation. We didn't give in to the Americans. I would watch for that. The British, the French, and the Germans are trying to create the equivalent of that, but I don't think they can create as much as Putin can. And Putin might want to do it because then he thinks Trump will continue to maintain the policy that effectively favors him. You know, if we don't militarily support Ukraine, then Putin sees time's on his side. But if we militarily support Ukraine, time is not on his side. They're suffering 20,000 casualties a month, but they have much larger forces. If Ukraine is going to be sustained militarily, then he has a fundamental problem. If he looks like he can come in and help us not have to go to war with the Iranians, I expect him to try to do that. So, in other words, the diplomacy may take different forms. You're going to see tomorrow an effort by actually, I think it's today, the British, the French, and the German foreign ministers with the Iranian foreign minister. If we were doing this next week after that meeting, I would give you more of an assessment of what I think is likely to happen. But I would suggest let's see what they do, and then let's see if we see Putin enter the fray.
Right. Another factor in a very complicated situation. Ambassador, I want to thank you so much for taking this time to brief our community and to offer this expert analysis. I think we're all hungry for as much information as we can get and as much analysis and understanding because it's such an important kind of fulcrum point for Israel. So with that, I'm going to close out our webinar for today. Wish people a Shabbat Shalom. And we can be continuing this discussion in days and weeks to come. Thank you.